there. Good morning, Joe. How are you doing?
Hey, good morning, Blake. Great to see you today.
Yeah, if anybody that's been tuning in over the past couple weeks, Blake here. Yeah, just on the Around the Bend podcast, we have Joe Bresler, the CEO and really the owner of Rockridge Digital Consultancy. Why don't you give us a little bit of your background, Joe?
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. First off, when I think about the things that I do for others as well, is I really am that person who is able to go deep into the data, especially in marketing and sales data,
Hmm.
pull out those insights that sometimes others can't find, and then take those insights and put them into an action plan. And typically, that action plan is around driving growth, driving scale, helping
Hmm.
companies move into new markets with new products,
Hmm.
move across geographies, any number of things that we do with that in terms of just taking the data and then moving it into an action plan.
I see. Okay. And I mean, I'm very rudimentary when it comes to that. I've always been in like client facing roles, pretty much most of my career up to this point. So when it comes to any of the analytics, the sales ops, any of that, it's just kind of over my head. And I know that kind of off camera, we were talking about how there's this big gap between sales and marketing in a lot of cases where I feel like a lot of salespeople are always like, oh, got to be hungry. Let's close the sale, like contact. And marketing, it's like trying to win the big picture kind of things.
Yeah, well, I think it really comes down to, well, first off, let's kind of start with an observation as well. And I think you and I can agree on this one. Sometimes there have been cases in organizations where we see marketing and sales just not on the same page. And
Hmm.
I'm being a little bit soft with that. Sometimes I'm seeing finger pointing. Sometimes I'm seeing a lot of discussion back and forth around things like data quality, the quality of the leads, volume of the leads, timing of the leads, you name it. Um, what I find is that it's really important between marketing and sales to get the team members on the same page. There's a
Hmm.
lot of different things that go into that. But I would say one of the most critical things, and there's a lot in terms of how you kind of deploy this out through the organization, but one of the most critical things is really agreeing on who are you going after and making sure that you have the right targeting, the right ICP, so ideal customer profile.
Hmm.
Now, when I have worked with companies around this, around the ICP, one of the things that comes up a lot of times is, well, we don't know, or we have a lot of products. We don't have just one ICP,
Hmm.
or, we don't really know what the ICP is, just that we thought it would be A, but we're still collecting data. And
Hmm.
I think one thing for companies to remember is that that's okay. Everybody needs to have some level of safety around experimentation and around collecting information, collecting data, a little bit of trial and error and testing.
Hmm.
I think that's really critical these days, is really being able to test and to learn and to do that quickly. So really having an environment where you bring the two teams together and you help them to come up with that action plan, to get something on paper, quote unquote. I know we're in a
Hmm.
digital world
Yeah.
these days, but on the digital paper, get something on digital paper for that ideal customer profile.
Hmm.
And then sometimes couple things. One is you can kind of back into it. So you look at your data, you see where there's been good wins. You compare that to where the product team believes that they have the biggest opportunity, or the product marketers, what have you.
Hmm.
Sometimes you find gaps and you find ways to bring those together.
Hmm.
In other cases, they're just you need to actually go out to data providers and go and find more bits and pieces of information, more data to build into a profile so you can have greater clarity. And that helps the teams then focus more, and also to be able to put together more thoughtful experiments and testing, so
Hmm.
that you can go back out and refine further.
in your experience, or at least because I know that you're kind of being a little bit coy. You don't just have your own digital consultancy. Joe was the former CMO at Informatica, one of the largest kind of like, how would I put it, like kind of data aggregate, kind of data actionable insight startups here in the Bay Area. They compete with like Informatica or with IBM, and even some of like Amazon's different like data lake and data warehousing products. So there's a lot of your career was centered around the data portion of it. But was it data insights for sales or just data insights for general marketing for like just products?
Yeah. So just for clarity purposes, most recently I was running at Informatica Digital. So there's others who were really more at that CMO level, but I was running digital and digital experience. So it's a data company, a data platform where people can come and house their data and integrate their data from lots of different disparate systems through essentially one pipe, go and clean it, normalize it, and get it prepped up for pulling into a data warehouse. Snowflake being one, DataStax being another, several different, AWS being another one. So several different data warehouses are available. And there are a lot of companies out there in that market now. In fact, as I have stricken out in the consultancy format, I've been looking more deeply at some of the competitors, and it's been very interesting to see that because I can now have a good benchmark in my mind as to where each company is at in their level of maturity of building out data platforms, data integration platforms, I should say. And so that's, but the data piece is a critical piece for being able to build out your ICP sometimes, and to really manage your analytics across all of marketing and sales for the whole company, for that matter, across other departments as well. But I bring up marketing and sales because it's really my area of specialization. I've dealt with, so how I kind of define my area of focus across my career is I define it as digital experience. But I know in the marketplace at large, everybody has their own definition of things. So I'll give you mine. So my definition of digital experience in terms of my background, it encompasses everything from web to web optimization, to email and marketing automation, to marketing operations, and out to the analytics piece as well. Because data is really a layer. It's a core that runs through all those areas. It's the way that, the most modern marketing organizations are going to function. They're functioning now, and they will function in the future as well. So I take a very holistic view on digital experience. Others may define it purely as like, oh, that's just the website. That's just MOPS. It's just one slice. And that's true. Those are slices of the bigger picture. But for me, how I describe my background is around digital experience, but looking at it from this more holistic perspective, especially since I've led teams in so many of these different areas, whether it's data science, marketing operations, marketing automation, demand gen, digital demand gen, running channels, execution channels like paid search, SEO, et cetera. So for me, I see it as all encompassing.
And I think, at least from a sales standpoint, a lot of people lose that big picture because marketing really does touch so many things. It's not just a website. It's not just a mobile app. It's like pretty much almost every other way that a customer or potential customer can engage with an organization that's not dealing with someone directly, not maybe directly communicating, but there's so many of these touch points that are hard to quantify. And I think that's one of the important things that a lot of organizations do now. And I think probably for the past 10 years, it's kind of been getting a little bit more refined to the point where it's like, I know that on Instagram and Facebook and just different social media platforms, like that became a really big extension of some of the marketing, outside of just your traditional avenues, because you can directly record all those touch points with your clients and where are you getting the most touch points, and then whether it's social media or other means, taking those touch points, translating that data into like an actionable thing for a future campaign, or even just to convert those people over.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think these days, every company's at its own level of maturity for being able to bring together the data that they have for sales and marketing, um, and to be able to use it. But again, in this area, I kind of put it in two buckets. One is bringing it together and actually giving visibility to it. The other one
Mm-hmm.
is actually interpreting it, interpreting that data and all the information, and being able to do something with it,
Mm-hmm.
and to be able to make those decisions. And where I see a lot of companies get stuck is through that entire process,
Mm-hmm.
where a lot of companies are that I've worked with in the past, um, is there's a lot of different tools. So a lot of people approach it from, I like this tool, I like that tool, this one looks great, they gave me a great deal, and they start to cobble it together. And you need to do that from a perspective of just getting what you need.
Of
But
course.
then you end up in an organizational perspective as like what I call data everywhere.
Yes.
There's data everywhere. Every one of these tools is giving you signals, as an end user or as someone who needs to interpret the data. But then you got to bring it together. You got to
Mm-hmm.
make it meaningful for the users, and then they need to be trained on how to interpret the data. So that's
Mm-hmm.
that second piece. So I've worked with a lot of sales teams, and sometimes it's a visibility issue. They're just not getting the data in to see, what did this person interact with? How did they engage? How did they come to me today? They just
Mm-hmm.
get something in their queue and they're expected to action it.
Yep.
What is a better place for companies to be in is when they can actually have the information, the right information. It doesn't necessarily mean more information, but have the right information so that they can go and make an informed interpretation of the data to
Mm-hmm.
be able to then go take their next step actions in their role, whether that's being an outbound calling rep, typically called a BDR, business development rep, or an inbound rep who's taking leads coming in off of the website or through other channels, and they're having to follow up right away. Either way, they're still trying to figure out, where did this come from? What did we do? What did they do? What digital signals are they showing me? And how can I go and have a good conversation with them so I can help to move them along the buyer's journey more quickly towards
Mm-hmm.
a close, and make sure that I'm serving their needs with the product or the service that I'm here to talk about.
Of course. And actually that's from a direct client facing perspective, the data you have going into a call or engaging with a client or potential client is super, super, super important. So knowing, like you said, knowing where that came from, was it just they clicked on something on the website and that's what brought that lead to you? Or were they reading that website for 30 minutes and they already have a pretty good understanding of what's going on? There's many cases where I do data. I'm hunting for data before I go and call somebody, or even if I have a meeting set up, I want to know what's our past history, what is their experience with our brand, Robert Half, where I'm working, have they used other vendors? There's all these data points that if I can get those and front load those before I talk with someone, that will make my success rate and just the overall interaction just so much better, as opposed to just kind of, let's see what happens. That's not a good way for organizations to run. But even there's a lot of large organizations that aren't really tapping into the data. They're not really trying to maximize it. And I think that even in the marketing space, like there's so many people that say, oh, I'm a digital consultancy, but what you're talking about and what you're operating on is like what the best, most cutting edge companies are trying to do, but even they have issues doing it correctly, And I think getting people to understand what you're concentrating on is like much, much higher level than making a social media campaign or let's redesign our UI this month. It's like, how do we really find where the data is and bring that into the correct pipeline and bring it into the right, filter it all out. Like I have some friends that are data scientists and data engineers, and that's, that's a whole huge, massive project for any of these companies, just trying to take what you have and even find out what you have, because sometimes they have these big, huge, actionable pools of data that are not being touched.
Yeah, yeah, that's one thing that I've found as well that is a critical thing for me to work on with clients and so forth is dealing with the data overwhelm. So there are just many, many points of information that are being generated every day from every system. But narrowing it down to just the most critical things that each person needs for their role, that's probably one of the most important things to do. And one of these in a process, to work through the process of getting people the right analytics. Sure, there are 100 things, and I like to catalog as much, all or as much as is being generated. In fact, this was one of the critical steps that I took at BlackRock when we were changing out systems that had been in place for 10 years. Really kind of catalog everything together, but still have in mind, even up front, so you always think with the end in mind, but even up front, you just have in mind, like, okay, there may be 100 things. Let's write them all down. Again, old school, write it down,
Yeah.
type it in, of course. But then let's just make sure we are clear on what we're trying to get, what's going to drive the business forward, and then what's going to give us that. And those then go into essentially, those data elements essentially go into our standardized reports that everybody can operate off of, and that can help to bring that clarity and that alignment between marketing and sales. And again, other teams as well, like finance and HR, or manufacturing and some companies. But then the other things, then how I look at it is everything else, it could be interesting. It could be still highly relevant, but there's probably a different use for it. And in those cases, then that's where data science teams come in, data analytics teams come in, because then if you do need a deeper discovery on the data, that's where you've got to really get hands-on, go deep, pull out all the different elements. And that's why I like to start with creating essentially a data dictionary, because you got to know, what are you working with? Where is it coming from? What's that data look like? You also got to deal with things like data completeness, because that, if you don't have complete data or clean data, it can really throw off your analysis. So that's where, like I mentioned, I like to split it up between where the most critical things driving the business. Those go into some of our standardized reports that we align around, and what are the things that really require a deeper analysis and can certainly bring up more novel solutions and answer more detailed questions. But the most critical thing to me, and the first priority, is getting everybody on that same page with, the core of what you need.
Absolutely. I mean, especially too, working with all the different sized companies you have, like you've done the startup space, you've done large companies, you've been at Oracle. How long, just because I have no kind of clue, how long does it take to build out these pipelines and kind of, let's say, get an actionable insight? Let's say if they tasked you, or if you were even just reviewing the data or trying to say, okay, we have a new data source, or we've identified a new data source, what does that process look like? Because I think for a lot of people, like the way that we're talking and that you're talking, like I have a general idea and people have a general idea, but it's like there's so many steps in between that it just sounds like it's honestly a little bit over my head, and probably for a couple of the people watching too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will just start with saying that, every project, when we do these types of things, looks a little bit different, although we may have, similar tool sets and so forth. And even if it's different tools that are generating the data, especially if it's in the marketing and sales space, they're generally still generating the same type of data, the same type of interactions for the most part. I mean, let's face it. So a click on an email is still going to be a click. Doesn't matter if you're using, email service provider 1, email service provider 2, or email service provider 3. So that's standard. But each one is a little bit different. Each one, there's different complexity with getting the data out of the tool and having it usable. But it really entails the chunks of work of making sure that the tools that are generating data are stable and that we understand what they're generating, how and why. Bringing that all into, thinking through like where are you going to place that data and what are you going to do with it? And then essentially just how are you going to bring them all together, bring all those pieces of data together. And that's really where you have that data integration piece or data integration layer. And where you bring it together typically, as you mentioned, a lot of times it's either called a data lake, which is more frequently unstructured data like you'll get from social media and some of these other, and maybe in some cases from web interactions, things like this, or structured data, which is things like you would get from web forms, just very standardized data, that sort of thing. But typically it'll go into a data lake where you can have different types of data coming together, or if you can get it structured and structured enough, then you can just go directly into a data warehouse, or a smaller version of that as a data mart. So there's a lot of terminology. I understand it can be a little bit daunting, and it changes all the time too. Those things that I described are pretty standard, but there's always something new coming up. But that's really just thinking about it in just simple terms. It's really just what's generating data, where do you want to put it, and what do you want to do with it, and how do you want to interact with that data, and then how are you just going to bring it together. And so you asked about timelines. Again, each project is going to be, it's going to look a little bit different. Sometimes, a lot of times what people do is they just connect point to point, so like one system to the other, and that can be done in minutes. And then you aren't really taking it into a data warehouse. You're taking everything into Marketo or into Salesforce or something like this, and that's kind of acting as a proxy of a data warehouse. Or you can go all the way and work on a data warehouse. And in particular, you may want to do that if you're doing things like you have a SaaS product, and that's providing you with signals as well around user usage, intent, profile, these sorts of things. So it's a matter of just kind of combining the data that way. So it can take anywhere from minutes to months or longer. It just depends. Every project is different, and how you approach it is different.
Yeah, and you want to make sure that especially when the complexity goes up really high, and you're bringing in different. In some cases, I've seen clients that are bringing in like data engineers, data scientists, business analysts, all onto one project. You really want to make sure you have someone with the right experience who's kind of been around the block, seen it, because when those projects go out of control, they go super out of control. I liked how you mentioned the stability factor, where, we've seen cases where we've watched, let's say, some mid-sized MSPs out there. I'm not going to mention who, but they've tried to, let's say, set it up for a client, and they're still in the data stability portion that you kind of mentioned. And like, if you identify the wrong data sets, or you're collecting that data in the wrong way, and then you create the wrong actionable insights that aren't really actionable insights, then you kind of have to scrap it. And, some companies spend thousands, some spend tens, hundreds of thousands, and some spend in the millions, we've seen. And just like even digital transformation and IT projects that I often am like assisting customers with, if you do it wrong, it goes really wrong. If you do it right, it goes really right.
Yeah, absolutely. If I think back to kind of large scale projects, so I mentioned before, about the consultancy that I'm working with. So just a little bit around there. I've got a couple partners right now. One is a little more on the performance media side. The other one's a little more on the e-commerce side. And for the partner that is more on the e-commerce side, he and I worked through a marketing transformation and an e-commerce transformation together at HP. That's the type of project that really took upwards of a year, just to kind of give you a perspective on, and that was really pushing it. But it was a very large project, incorporated many, many different systems and tools. and was also run across geographies. So we had people
Mhm.
in basically every geography working on each little piece and part of that project. So it was pretty massive.
Oh wow. I mean, HP is like an international company, so it's like we're managing a project of that size. Like, how was the stress level on something like that?
Well, I will do a shout out to my team. In this case, I had a team. I'll just speak for my team. I had a team of about over 240 people, so about 244 people.
Okay.
Also across the globe. So some people in Europe, some people in North America, multiple locations, people in China, people in India. Um, and so one thing that I knew I needed to get in place right away was a really good, strong project management office.
Mhm.
And I had folks on my team who were just very excellent. Again, just kind of giving a shout out to those folks. Um, they did a great job of keeping all the pieces and parts organized and on track.
Mhm. I mean, especially too when you're dealing with those big, massive projects, like you have to make sure one, you have the right people doing the right stuff, the deadlines are met. It's a stressful, luckily I've never had to be a part of one, but it's like I don't know what I'd be like one of those what do you call them, the sports commentators. I just kind of sit on the sidelines, especially in the recruiting space. We get the resources out there, we make sure our people are working, but at the end of the day we just sit back and let those companies manage those projects, and it's kind of like an armchair commentator. I'm like, oh, and it looks like this project's going way over budget.
That's certainly a risk. That's where the PMO, so if you think about it, like, so what you're doing is you're doing recruiting, you're bringing in resources. I actually don't care for that term too much because they're people, and I
Yes.
really care a lot about the people that I work with and that work for me. But nonetheless, we'll use the term because it's an industry term. So you're bringing in resources, and that project management office or project manager needs to be able to help you with predicting the demand for the resources, tracking the utilization, and then do an effective job of onboarding and offboarding for the different phases of the project, and really keep each one of those phases together. That's where that's such a critical and pivotal role, especially for an implementation or for a digital transformation, anything like that. That's people always think about, like, the technical resource. Yeah, that's critical. The executive sponsorship. Oh my God, yes, that is incredibly critical.
Yes.
But the PMO is often the unsung. The PMO and the project management office and the project managers are often
Mhm.
the unsung heroes, is what I've found, because they've got to keep everything on track.
100%. And it's almost like a temporary, depending on the organization. Like, we work with like United Healthcare and other ones that have like dedicated PMOs that are always running. But in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of cases, the organizations will set up a PMO for like some kind of strategic initiative. It's almost like I'm not sure, good analogy, it's like a military campaign, and those are the generals making sure it gets done. And it's gonna, all that responsibility also will fall on them if it doesn't work well. So you need the right people in there that are willing to take that responsibility for good, the bad, and the ugly kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And actually, I like how you mentioned, you don't like using the term resources. I don't really either, but a lot of the people that we work with like, oh yeah, we need some IT resources or we need some like data science resources. It's like, well, my candidates, I'll never say that to them,
Yeah.
So I think
Exactly.
it's, at the end of the day, it's good, to hear you kind of doing the humanizing aspect of it. Cause I've finding it's kind of funny too. Like people think like, oh, you should just be able to like, get me 10 data engineers. And it's like, yeah, no, because they're not data engineers. It's like Tom and Sue and, on it. I can't, it's like I got to make sure every person's in line with whatever that thing is that's going on and just kind of line up all those pieces. So it's like sometimes I love big projects. Sometimes I hate them because it's like you're managing, like they're dealing with like, let's say 300 parts, and whoever, I help introduced to their team, like I'm managing all those relationships and like, oh, well, this person, if like it's at HP, well, this person was kind of mean today and somebody took my sandwich from the break room, and like those things you think are like, come on, that can't be real. I'm like, yeah, unfortunately it's becomes big a deal.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was in a conversation with colleagues last night about that sort of thing where, there's just all the human aspects, so like I like to talk about, so I've led teams as small as just myself, maybe one other person, and I've led teams over 240 people. So, but every one of those sizes of teams has its own levels of complexity, its own amount of abstraction, as a leader, like how far abstracted you are from the front lines, So a lot of different aspects around there. But as I mentioned before, for me, thinking about team leadership and motivation, I think about these folks, regardless of how big or how small the team is, as people and as people that, I need to watch out for and care for and, and make sure that they're being well cared for because they are the ones that are producing all the great work. As a leader, I may be setting the direction and kind of managing the overall process. But they're the ones that are delivering the individual nitty gritty things that have got to get done on a day-to-day basis. So I like to try to take good care of the folks that are working for me, regardless of what the scenario is.
And knowing you for the time I have, you're a pretty chill, down to earth kind of person. Because I think the weird thing I've kind of learned in this industry is that you get the really high level and I don't want to say lower level, but people that are kind of on the ground getting stuff done are can oftentimes be the most humble and easy to work with. And I found that sometimes, you get to that middle tier in a lot of bigger companies, and sometimes people don't, they don't acknowledge or care as much about that human factor because they're so used to managing 300 people and having names on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a weird thing I've realized, like, I'll have a conversation with I remember in the same day, it was a very large financial institution here in the Bay Area. I called an IT auditing manager and extremely rude, like one of the worst calls I've ever had, just very blatantly rude on the phone. And then I called the CTO of that same company, super nice, wasn't even upset that I had basically taken up 10 minutes of his day. And it was such a shocking 180 in a conversation. And I think it's important that we don't get too lost in our work or our personal whatever's going on that day. It's a human, whether you're doing engineering or marketing or sales or even admin work, it's a human. Everything is human based, so we got to treat people correctly.
Yeah, that's true. I think as a leader, one thing that that I've found is, I think earlier in your career, it's a little bit about, let's say all about me. What do I want? Where do I want to get to? When you get to a point, though, then you realize that it's not really all about you. It's about them. It's about the team. And, as a leader, you've got to try to bring them up. You've got to have a positive attitude. You've got to show up each day and try to provide motivation, and really just try to figure out the best way that you can balance, getting the work done, but also keeping everybody on track and helping people feel like things are sane, especially when everybody's under a lot of pressure or have tight deadlines, this sort of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is some good perspective. I mean, I didn't even realize you'd managed a project of that size. That's pretty large.
Yeah. It's been, like I mentioned, I've led teams really small. So I've been in companies that are as small as 4 people. So I was in a bootstrap startup early in my career, way before all the funding and founding and all the other stuff that goes on today got to the point where it is today. I've been in other startups as well. So I've been in companies that are, 4 people, 35 people, 250 people, 400 people, 5,000 people,
Mm-hmm.
40,000 people,
Dang.
250,000 people.
Dang.
So it really, my background and what I've been involved in has really run the gamut.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing too is that even if I've not at that moment in time in my career, if I've not been in a startup at that moment, I've usually been involved in startup initiatives. So, for example, Oracle, I came in to run and to help build out the e-commerce initiative. First, from a perspective of building out a channel, an e-commerce channel, and then moving on to product, and then moving on to actually marketing, and also business consulting. Same sort of area, all around CRM, customer experience. Then I've also been involved in other companies where just the experience has been a little bit different. So even with startups, so Oracle's a really big company, but even with startups, they still face a lot of the same challenges that bigger companies do. And I've worked with them on starting up initiatives or kind of fixing things, improving, taking it to the next level, that sort of thing. But even startups face a lot of the same a lot of the same problems that bigger companies do. It's just the magnitude is a little bit different. Sometimes the speed that you can move at can be a little bit different. Those sorts of things. It's kind of more of the finer points.
Oh, absolutely. And I think too, it's kind of interesting because knowing you and kind of knowing your background, you switching into this digital consultancy, like you could have done a lot of other things besides, kind of doing your own consultancy. But I know that it's sort of a passion project and really like where do you like to specialize and what gets you most energized, about the projects you get to do there?
Yeah. So just thinking a little bit about my background. So I've actually run teams and initiatives in pretty much every area of marketing. So I've run field marketing initiatives, I've run campaigns teams and built them out several times. So demand gen, run digital channels, again, like run the full digital experience. So if I just think about kind of where I've focused the most attention and energy over the last, let's say, 10 to 12 years, it has been a little bit more towards that data, the analytics, and then so I'm taking the approach of like how that impacts all those other areas. So how
Mm-hmm.
does having good data impact demand generation success?
Mm-hmm.
How does having good data and connected systems impact being able to deliver a great customer experience or digital experience,
Mm-hmm.
across channels? How can I get better at targeting and segmentation and tracking to improve the performance in channels like SEO and SEM, those sorts of things.
Of course.
So that's kind of the
Absolutely.
mindset that I have right now is really more around the data, the analytics, but then how
Mm-hmm.
it impacts all those other areas. A lot of people approach it, and everybody has their own perspective and their own approach. A lot of people might approach it from the opposite direction, which is, I want to go do SEO. Great. I want to go do, search marketing. Go do something else. Great.
Good jump on Upwork.
You know, but yeah, I mean, like for me, the one common thread is that the data piece and the analytics and the ability to analyze, and like I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned earlier in the call, tease out the insights
Mm-hmm.
and pick it apart and say, okay, aha, I really have a hunch here. This is what I'm seeing here. This is what I want to go do and focus on to help to improve the performance. Because that's actually that's one of the reasons why I wanted to get into marketing in the first place. When I went to UC Berkeley, so I did my bachelor's at UC Berkeley in the Hoff School, and then later on I did an MBA at a school called Holy Names. And in both cases, I still focused on marketing
Mm-hmm.
because I've always been very interested in that human interaction, what drives people, what drives actions, and what can I learn from it, and then how can I modify and change. my approach for, driving the performance up.
Hmm. I mean, it's definitely a human-based business, and I think that seeing the people I've seen in the space, you definitely have a little bit more of a calm, chill demeanor with the right kind of go after it under the surface, where there's a lot of I'll just say it, bullshit artists, in sales and marketing, that they talk a bunch of shit and they think they're the hottest thing that's ever been. But at the end of the day, it comes out to how do you work with people and what are your results? And even if you're a superstar, if you're not building teams and building success on repeatably, it doesn't really matter, and I see that a lot in sales. There's a lot of bullshit artists, a lot of big egos. I've seen it occasionally in marketing, but it's, you either can get it done or you can't over time,
Yeah. Good perspective on that.
Yeah. And I apologize. I do kind of got to wrap up here.
Okay.
But I want to say thank you, Joe, for
Yeah.
taking the time out and talking with me. And, I'm going to get this put up on YouTube and Apple Podcasts so anybody can watch it there. And I'll get it out on LinkedIn as well for people to take a look. And like and subscribe, and also post this on Joe's page. So anybody that, is looking for a really tailored marketing approach, especially when it comes to the data analytics, actionable insights, and that sort of thing. Joe's based here in the Bay Area, and I'll have him and his company linked on this post.
Sounds great. Well, thanks once again. Really appreciate it. Hopefully your viewers and listeners enjoy it.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe.
With you. Thanks. Have a great day. We'll see you soon.
See ya.
Okay.